Let me come to another challenge for integral, specifically for doing integralism, which has not so much to do with integral itself, but with its environment. Doing integralism in our present-day society is something that is not particularly supported. Most environments are actually explicitly hostile to integralism. Integralism is usually driven by what has been called grand narratives, or the wish to connect many different particular strands of knowledge into one big whole. And within academia, grand narratives have come into a very difficult position. It's very difficult to defend grand narratives. You will be usually taken apart pretty fast by established academic institutions if you try to do grand narrative. It is almost impossible to do grand narrative and at the same time work at an academic institution. I think there are only a few examples of people who manage to be both, to be specialists, accepted academics, and also do grand narrative. Most of them fail. And Peterson is maybe one of these few exceptions, but I'm not so sure whether he's really that well accepted within the academic sphere itself. And there are many reasons why the environment is so hostile to grand narrative. It is often as simple things as how we are taught to think and how we are taught to write at universities. At my universities, for example, it was a typical task that we had to solve. We were given a specific topic and we had to write 5 pages on that topic. We had to fill 5 pages with content. What that taught us, of course, is how to fill pages with content. It didn't teach us how to think clearly. It didn't teach us how to distinguish valid from less valid thoughts. And it's obvious that students find ways of cheating and making it as easy as possible for them to get through the system. Just as small kids already, when it's cool, find ways to manipulate the system, so do students, of course. So what students were taught with this simple task, basically they learned to fill pages with text. And I was very satisfied actually when some of our professors were really horrified at the kind of literature that we produced. I mean, if you think about, students who are just starting to read classical philosophy, they have really absolutely no clue about it. And yet they come up with texts that even our professors can't understand, they can't make sense of. And this was really one of these few moments of satisfaction that I had, where I felt that they had tasted some of their own medicine, because they couldn't understand a word that we are saying, and they assumed we must be stupid, right? Because since we're so inexperienced, what we're saying is on the surface very difficult to distinguish between a very deep and meaningful text, but it must be rubbish, right? It must be nonsense, since we're so inexperienced. This might seem like a small detail to you, but it's something that goes through all of academia. The way we produce texts in academia is not built around the idea of efficient communication and saying not more than you actually have to say. This makes it very difficult to do grand narrative, because your job as the grand narrator is to look at a discourse and see the pearl, see that which is really essential to take out of it and bring back into society or bring back into the life world of everyone. Now, the more text there is out there, the more difficult it gets for you to find those pearls. And particularly postmodern discourse is such a mess. It just takes forever for you to really grasp the major ideas, and it's almost impossible to disentangle this really huge mess of often convoluted language that is not really making that much sense. That's another problem. It's the problem of bullshit. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's maybe the most prominent problem of philosophy of the 20th century, the problem of bullshit. Many philosophers have actually been thinking about how it's possible for us to produce sentences, to produce speech that sounds meaningful, but in the end, when you really look very closely at it, you find out it wasn't meaningful. We thought it was, We thought it made sense. But exposed, we find out we were just talking nonsense. And we actually bullshitted ourselves. We really didn't even notice that we weren't making sense from the start. How is it possible to say something, to feel like you're saying something meaningful, but actually to say nothing at all? That's one of the most prominent problems in philosophy in the last 50 years, and I don't think it's a coincidence. But this, of course, the problem of bullshit. And as John Searle once said, we have like names for different ages, and maybe this is the age of bullshit. This really makes it very difficult for anyone who tries to do grand narrative to distinguish that which is really essential to know and which is important to know from that which is not. Because it's not an intrinsic interest of the disciplines to make themselves comprehensible. It's not in their own interest, just as it's not in the interest of a dentist to make everyone else a good dentist. It's not in their own interest to make everyone as good as they are in their own respective field, because of course the moment others are as good as you are, you will have more competition. And since your field is usually connected to the market system and you're making money with it, it's not in your own personal interest to be a good educator. You would actually do much better if you're a really bad educator and make it for people particularly difficult to get where you are. These are some mutually contradictory interests that are running for all of our institutions that really, really make it difficult to communicate the essence of what you have to say. It's just not in your own interest as a specialist to communicate efficiently and to really say what you have to say in not a single word more than that. We're not taught to do that, and again, you would actually you would dig your own grave if you did it in many cases. These are factors that make it really difficult to do grand narrative. Let me think of another one. Yeah, complexity obviously is one. Our specific disciplines have been so differentiated in the past 50 years that it's really, really difficult to keep track of it. I mean, even within a single discipline, you often have dozens of discourses that are mutually exclusive and contradicting each other. It's pretty difficult to keep track of all that. I don't think it's in principle because our minds are not built to contain the really, really important ideas that are out there and that you really have to grasp. I mean, there are certain things that you really have to have thought and understood. Others are a bit more contingent. It really doesn't make that much of a difference whether you know them or you don't. And I'm with Arthur Lovejoy on this one. I think he's right in his observation that the really important ideas, those that really make a difference, if you want the perennial ideas, are actually not that many. Maybe you've had this experience as well. For me, it's often like I might be reading for months and I might be feeling like I'm learning new details, but I really rarely have these eureka moments where I feel that something really important and new has been added to my own picture. This often happens to me only every few months, if you think about it. So it's not the number of ideas that really matter that is so vast, despite the plurality of ideas that are out there. I think if you look at the deep structures, if you want to use a metaphor, loose metaphor from integral theory, if you look at the deep structures, I think the ideas that really matter are actually not that many, and every single mind could manage to cope with them. But to find them, that's the really, really big challenge, because you will spend most of your time reading bullshit. As Wilber says, you will easily spend 90% of your time reading stuff that just simply is making no sense, and no one really knows what they're actually saying, and no tradition is exempt from this. We usually know this from spiritual traditions, and we usually accuse spiritual traditions of bullshitting us all the time, which they are, obviously. But it's not only spiritual traditions, it's pretty much any strand of knowledge. They all are bullshitting us. I don't want to go into details why this is so. I think there are systemic reasons why this is necessarily so. It has something to do with how we make sense of reality in general. But I think that's maybe the only fact that all the disciplines agree on. Everyone agrees that everyone else is talking bullshit, right? So maybe there is something to that. Maybe there is indeed a lot of bullshit out there. And how to distinguish the valid from the invalid thinking is really a problem. And we have to come up with solutions that are much more efficient than just to give people a few thousand books to read and decide for themselves. This is not going to work. This is also a topic that Phil raised, how you could build mechanisms of validation, maybe into software, that would help you to find the really important jewels, if you want, at least point you to the right kind of literature. I think on a software basis we could do a lot in this regard to make it much more easy for us to find the really relevant injunctions, if you want. And there are other approaches as well. I mean, if you're in a community of integralists whose job is to find these pearls, it of course becomes much easier for you to orient yourself, which authors might have something to say and which haven't. This is something I see the intellectual dark web people doing. They're inviting individual voices who all, have really important parts of the bigger picture to contribute, and you learn through the intellectual dark web people and the Rebel Wisdom channel, for example. I came across a lot of thinkers that I didn't know about, and if I were to be left alone, I guess it would have taken me decades to even discover them. So I think there are ways of systematizing this, but we aren't really there yet. You're still mostly left alone with this kind of selective process. And we have to become more efficient and use all the quadrants or create structures in all the quadrants to help us with this process of selection.